How is your ego tonight? Is it somewhere lost in your id? What am I talking about? I know, do you? It's really kind of interesting and important. Well, it's about time to begin your session with the Beverly Hills Shrink.
The Beverly Hills Shrink is not diagnosing anyone in this episode. He recommends you see your own healthcare provider for personal information about treatments and medication. Back to the episode.
Who's Sigmund Freud? Have you ever heard of him? He's really an incredibly influential person in numerous cultures, societies, and particularly psychiatry and psychology. He's been poo-pooed for years because he was too smart and too articulate. But we'll get to that later. Do you have an ego? What is an ego? Any guesses? Anybody know? Well, Freud had three major aspects of the mind: the ego, the superego, and the id. The superego is very complicated and will be dealt with in another session. The ego is you. It's your consciousness and unconsciousness, the identity you have, the person you are or become. I, the ego. What the heck is an id? I thought I had one in my pocket, but I lost it. An id is a raging cauldron of emotion, desire, impulse, anger, frustration, rage. It's basically an infant. If you're 32 and you still have a wild, uncontrolled id, you're a menace to society. It's somewhere between flagrant narcissism and absolute sociopathy. There are no boundaries in the id. There's no valences. There's no good. There's no bad. There's never enough of whatever id wants. You don't tell an id no. You don't tell an id wait. The id knows yes, now. Nothing else. Nothing else. So Freud was a smart person. Why is his name still around? There were all kinds of people in the late 1800s and through the 1900s coming up with psychological theory. And the only one that has hung on since the beginning of this period is Sigmund Freud. You can hear people who say, Freud is wrong. This has to do with object relations. This has to do with your emotional thermometer, or whatever it is. It all devolves back to Freud's general concepts. Not all of them were right, but the general concepts of ego, superego, and id. But most of the brilliant schools of psychological and psychoanalytic thought still devolve to the three major elements. Certainly Freud was very focused on sexuality, which in the late 1800s and early 1900s was a little bit ahead of its time, which is one of the reasons a lot of people couldn't tolerate Freud, because it was too sexy. So people came out with other versions of the urges that people have and the goals that people have, but they still had an ego, a superego, and an id. The ego, as it matures and becomes an adult observing ego, has to control the id. There's a struggle through childhood and adolescence, and the winner determines your life. If you can't control your id, you've got serious problems trying to function in society without telling people off, punching them out, slashing their tires, trashing them online, or whatever. It has to do with manners, courtesy, turning the other cheek, keeping your mouth shut. These are things the ego demands. These are things the id hates. You may not know the old terminology that goes back to the late 1880s, early 1890s and above. If you ever want to read something fascinating, this is an aside. Something that was prescient and remarkable, but Freudian and sexy. Read Freud's 3 essays on sexuality, published in 1905. The James Strachey translation is the ultimate translation in English. Well, what does it tell you? Oh, it's got the word sexuality in it, and 1905 and sexuality in public was not popular. But it talked about the development of the human being, the development of sexuality. It talked about many things. It predicted the discovery of hormones. Freud thought of it before anybody else. So, where was I? This is our first session on psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, and Freud. Any therapist who doesn't know this should be looking for a job as a waitress or a waiter. Our session is almost over. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I will be answering questions on our Patreon. And remember, always try to be on time on the couch for the Beverly Hills Shrink.